Every Saturday morning, I woke up to footprints across my backyard. At first, I thought it was just kids cutting through the neighborhood. Then I found empty coffee cups on my patio, a lawn chair moved, my garden gate left wide open. One weekend, I looked out my kitchen window and froze. My next-door neighbors weren't just crossing my yard anymore. They were carrying coolers, folding chairs, and even pushing a stroller straight through my property like it was a public park. When I politely asked them to stop, they laughed. "Relax," the husband said. "It's only a shortcut." A shortcut? Across land I paid for every month? I tried being reasonable. I installed signs, locked the gate, even spoke to the HOA. Nothing changed. If anything, they became even bolder. Then one afternoon, the wife smiled at me and said something I'd never forget. "You can't prove anything." That sentence changed everything. The very next day, I installed a single security camera where nobody expected it. I thought it would capture people walking across my yard. I had no idea it was about to record something that would destroy their confidence and change the entire neighborhood forever. My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 31 years old, and until last spring, I honestly believed I'd found the perfect place to spend the rest of my life. My little house sat at the end of a quiet suburban street outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't huge or luxurious, but it was mine. I had worked for nearly 10 years as a mechanical engineer, saved every bonus, skipped expensive vacations, and finally bought the home I'd always wanted. The biggest reason I chose it wasn't the kitchen or the garage. It was the backyard. A 6-foot wooden fence surrounded most of it, with mature maple trees providing shade and enough space to enjoy peaceful weekends. I spent countless Saturdays grilling burgers, reading books on the patio, and growing tomatoes in raised garden beds. After stressful work weeks, that backyard felt like my personal escape. The family next door moved in about 6 months after I did. Mark and Jennifer Collins seemed friendly enough during our first conversation. They introduced themselves, mentioned they had 2 children, and joked about finally finding a neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other. I welcomed them with homemade cookies and genuinely hoped we'd become good neighbors. For the first few weeks, everything seemed normal. Then one Saturday morning, while watering my tomato plants, I noticed fresh muddy footprints stretching across the middle of my lawn. They started near one side of the fence and disappeared through the back gate. I frowned, assuming someone had accidentally wandered through while walking their dog. I didn't think much about it. The following weekend, I found another trail of footprints. This time there were bicycle tire marks cutting straight across the grass I'd spent months carefully maintaining. Again, I convinced myself it couldn't be intentional. Maybe neighborhood kids were taking a shortcut. Maybe someone didn't realize they were crossing private property. I wanted to believe people were basically considerate. Then on the third Saturday, I finally saw it with my own eyes. Mark Collins casually opened my backyard gate, walked straight across my lawn carrying a folding chair, and disappeared through the opposite side, as if he had done it 100 times before. He never looked toward my house. He never knocked on my door. He never even hesitated. To him, my backyard wasn't someone's private property. It was simply the quickest path to wherever he wanted to go. Standing there with my garden hose still running beside me, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. I had no idea that simple assumption was about to become the biggest mistake I'd make all year. I didn't confront Mark that day. Instead, I convinced myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe he thought the previous owner had given permission. Maybe there was some misunderstanding I could clear up with one polite conversation. The following afternoon, I walked next door and rang the bell. Mark answered wearing sunglasses and holding a bottle of iced tea. He smiled like nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. "Hey, Ethan," he said. "What's up?" "I wanted to ask you about something," I replied. "Yesterday, I saw you walking through my backyard. I'd really appreciate it if you used the sidewalk instead. I'm trying to keep the yard in good shape." His smile didn't disappear. Instead, he chuckled. "Oh, that," he said casually. "We've always cut through there. Saves a couple of minutes." I blinked. "Understand," I answered, keeping my voice calm, "but it's still my property." He shrugged. "It's not hurting anything." Before I could respond, Jennifer stepped onto the porch carrying a basket of laundry. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Ethan doesn't want us using his backyard anymore," Mark said with a grin. Jennifer rolled her eyes. "It's just grass," she laughed. "People are so protective these days." I forced a polite smile. "I just prefer everyone stay on their own property." "Sure," Mark replied. His tone sounded agreeable. His expression didn't. I walked home hoping that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The very next Saturday, I looked outside while making coffee and watched Mark cross my yard again. This time, he wasn't alone. Jennifer followed, behind him, carrying a picnic basket while their 2 children raced across the lawn, laughing as they chased each other around my garden beds. I stepped outside immediately. "Mark!" He stopped halfway across the yard. "I thought we talked about this." He turned toward me without the slightest hint of embarrassment. "We're almost through," he called back. "Please don't use my yard." He laughed. "Relax, Ethan." Then he pointed toward the sidewalk running around the block. "That adds 5 whole minutes." Jennifer smiled as if I were the unreasonable one. "You'll survive." Before I could say another word, they continued walking, disappearing through my back gate as though my request had never happened. I stood there in complete disbelief. It wasn't just that they ignored me. It was how easily they dismissed my concerns. Over the next 2 weeks, little things started happening. The back gate was left open. Fresh footprints appeared after every weekend. A flower bed was accidentally trampled. Someone tossed an empty soda can near my patio furniture. Each incident by itself seemed minor. Together, they painted a very different picture. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was entitlement. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't dealing with careless neighbors. I was dealing with people who genuinely believed my property existed for their convenience. After that second conversation, I stopped believing the problem would solve itself. Instead of getting better, every weekend seemed to bring a new surprise. Saturday mornings became something I dreaded. I'd wake up, make a cup of coffee, glance through my kitchen window, and wonder what I'd find outside this time. Sometimes it was nothing more than fresh footprints cutting across the lawn. Other times it was much worse. One weekend, I found muddy tire tracks running straight through the grass where I'd spent weeks reseeding a bare patch. Another Saturday, my garden gate stood wide open, gently swinging in the wind. I always locked that gate before going to bed. Someone had opened it. The following weekend, I noticed several crushed tomato plants near the corner of my raised beds. They hadn't been destroyed intentionally, but someone had clearly walked far too close without caring where they stepped. Every incident seemed small enough to dismiss, but together they were becoming impossible to ignore. Then I noticed something even more frustrating. It wasn't just Mark and Jennifer anymore. Friends started following the exact same path through my backyard. One family pushed a stroller across the grass. Another carried folding chairs toward the neighborhood pond behind our homes. Teenagers rode bicycles through the opening in my fence without slowing down. It was as if my yard had quietly become part of a public walking trail. I couldn't understand it. Had Mark actually told people they could use my property? One Saturday afternoon, I counted 11 different people crossing my backyard in less than 2 hours. None of them knocked. None of them asked permission. Most never even looked toward my house. I finally started writing everything down. Dates, times, descriptions, how many people crossed, what damage I found afterward. At first it felt excessive. Then I realized I needed a record because every conversation with Mark ended the same way. It's not a big deal. It only takes a second. You're making this bigger than it is. Meanwhile, I was spending every Sunday repairing my yard instead of enjoying it. Reseeding grass, picking up litter, closing the gate, straightening garden decorations that had somehow been knocked over. The backyard I'd worked so hard to create no longer felt peaceful. It felt like a place I constantly had to defend. One evening, while I was replacing a broken solar garden light, I happened to look toward Mark's house. He was standing on his deck watching me. When our eyes met, he gave me a slow smile, lifted his drink as though we were sharing some private joke, then casually walked back inside. Something about that smile unsettled me. For the first time, I wasn't convinced they were simply being inconsiderate. It almost felt like they were enjoying every minute of it. By the beginning of the next month, I realized I couldn't solve this on my own. Every polite conversation had ended with another weekend of people marching across my backyard like nothing had happened. So I contacted our homeowners association. I wasn't asking them to punish anyone. I simply wanted someone in a position of authority to remind the Collins family that private property still mattered. A week later, an HOA representative named Susan stopped by my house. She listened carefully while I explained everything. Then we walked into the backyard together. I showed her the worn path cutting through the grass, the damaged flower beds, and the gate that never seemed to stay closed for long. She nodded thoughtfully. "I'll speak with them," she promised. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. That feeling lasted exactly 3 days. Saturday morning arrived. I looked outside expecting peace. Instead, I watched Mark stroll through my backyard carrying a cooler over one shoulder. Jennifer followed behind him with 2 folding chairs. Neither of them even glanced toward my house. It was almost as if the HOA conversation had encouraged them instead of stopping them. Monday afternoon, Susan called me back. "I spoke with your neighbors," she said carefully, "and they claim they've always used that route with permission from the previous homeowner." I frowned. "I bought this house 3 years ago. I understand. They also said they didn't realize it bothered you." I almost laughed. "I've asked them to stop twice." There was a long pause. Without independent evidence, Susan finally said, "It becomes one person's word against another's." I thank her anyway. She was trying to help. She just didn't have anything concrete to work with. Over the next several days, I quietly asked a few other neighbors if they'd noticed people crossing my yard. Most admitted they had. One elderly couple even apologized for not saying something sooner. "We've seen it," Mr. Henderson admitted. "So why didn't anyone speak up?" He sighed. "Mark likes arguments." His wife nodded. "People around here usually avoid him." That answer frustrated me more than I expected. Everyone knew what was happening. Nobody wanted to become the next target. A few evenings later, while taking out my trash, my next-door neighbor on the opposite side, Linda, walked over. She lowered her voice before speaking. "I've been watching all this," she said. "I think you're right." I smiled sadly. "Doesn't seem like anyone else does." "Oh, they do." She looked toward the Collins house before continuing. "They're just waiting for someone else to deal with it." "What would you do?" Linda didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the security light mounted above my garage. Then she looked back at me and smiled. "If people won't believe words," she said quietly, "give them something they can't argue with." She walked back toward her house before I could ask what she meant. But her advice stayed with me for the rest of the night. Linda's words echoed in my head for days. Give them something they can't argue with. At the time, I wasn't sure exactly what she meant. I figured she was talking about evidence, but I still hoped things wouldn't reach that point. Unfortunately, the Collins family had other plans. The following Friday evening, I finished mowing the lawn, put my gardening tools back inside the small storage shed, and relaxed on the patio with a glass of iced tea. Everything looked exactly the way I wanted it. The flower beds were neat. The tomato plants were recovering. The gate was locked. For the first time in weeks, I felt optimistic. That feeling disappeared the next morning. As soon as I stepped outside with my coffee, something felt wrong. My favorite steel garden shovel, the one I'd owned for years, wasn't leaning against the shed where I'd left it. I searched the entire backyard. Nothing. At first, I assumed I'd simply forgotten where I'd put it. But after checking the garage, basement, and even the front porch, I knew I hadn't misplaced it. 2 days later, one of my decorative solar lanterns disappeared from beside the patio. A week after that, a brand new pair of pruning shears vanished. None of the missing items were especially expensive. That wasn't the point. Someone had been entering my backyard often enough to know exactly where things were kept. The thought made my skin crawl. I walked next door one more time. Mark answered wearing the same relaxed smile he always seemed to have. "Everything okay, Ethan? I've had a few things disappear from my yard." His eyebrows lifted. "That's too bad. I was wondering if you've seen anyone back there." He shook his head immediately. "No." Jennifer appeared behind him. "What happened?" "Ethan thinks somebody's stealing from his backyard." She gave me an exaggerated look of sympathy. "Maybe you left something out. I know where I leave my tools." Mark folded his arms. "You've got no proof anyone took them." "I didn't accuse anyone." "Good," he replied with a slight grin. "Because that's a pretty serious accusation." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jennifer smiled. "You know, if you can't prove something happened." She shrugged. "Maybe it didn't." The words landed harder than either of them probably realized. They weren't trying to help. They were reminding me exactly how powerless I was. I thanked them for their time and walked home without another word. As I reached my back porch, I noticed fresh footprints crossing the damp grass again. They led directly through my yard before disappearing beyond a rear fence. I stared at them for several seconds. Then I remembered Linda's advice. People could deny conversations. They could deny footprints. They could deny missing property. But they couldn't deny clear video. Right then, standing in my backyard, I finally stopped thinking about installing a camera. I decided I was buying one the very next morning. The next morning, I skipped my usual routine. Normally, Saturdays meant coffee on the patio before sunrise. Instead, I grabbed my truck keys and drove straight to the nearest home improvement store. For the first time since this whole mess had started, I wasn't shopping for flowers, fertilizer, or lawn supplies. I was shopping for evidence. An employee in the security aisle asked if I needed help. "I need a camera that'll record day and night," I said. "Something reliable." He showed me several options. Some were expensive systems with multiple cameras and monthly subscriptions. Others were simple wireless units with motion detection and cloud storage. I chose one that recorded in high definition, stored footage automatically, and could send alerts directly to my phone. It wasn't cheap, but compared to months of frustration, it felt like money well spent. Driving home, I kept thinking about Mark's words. "You've got no proof." Jennifer's voice followed. Maybe it didn't happen. Those sentences had bothered me for days. Now they motivated me. I spent the afternoon reading the instruction manual twice before opening the box. I didn't want to rush anything. If I was going to do this, I wanted it done right. After studying my backyard from every angle, I found the perfect location beneath the corner of the garage roof. From there, the camera could clearly see the gate, the entire worn path across the lawn, my garden beds, and most of the patio. It was high enough to stay out of reach, but low enough to capture clear faces. I mounted the bracket carefully, connected the camera, and synced it with the mobile app. A live image appeared on my phone. Everything looked exactly as I'd hoped. I spent another hour walking across the yard myself, checking different angles and testing the motion alerts. Every notification arrived within seconds. Every recording was sharp enough to read the logo on my baseball cap. Satisfied, I deleted the test clips. The memory card was empty, ready for a fresh start. As the sun began to set, I sat quietly on the patio. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel anxious. I simply felt prepared. If nobody crossed my yard again, I'd happily return the camera and call the entire purchase an unnecessary expense. But deep down, I knew better. People who respected boundaries didn't ignore repeated requests. They certainly didn't laugh about them. That evening, before going inside, I locked the back gate one more time and glanced toward the Collins house. Their driveway was full. Several unfamiliar vehicles had arrived. I watched coolers, folding chairs, and picnic baskets being unloaded while children ran through the front yard laughing. Whatever they were planning, it looked like a gathering. I couldn't shake the feeling that the next morning would finally answer every question I'd been asking for weeks. So before heading to bed, I opened the camera app one last time, confirmed the recording light was blinking, and whispered to myself, "Let's see what the truth looks like." I barely slept that night. Every little sound outside made me glance toward the bedroom window, not because I expected anything dramatic to happen in the middle of the night, but because I knew the real test would begin the next morning. At 7:12 a.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. Motion detected. I sat upright instantly. Opening the camera app, I watched the live feed from my backyard. Nothing, just leaves moving in the morning breeze. A squirrel darted across the fence before disappearing into one of the maple trees. I almost laughed at myself. Maybe this whole thing had gotten into my head. Then, 23 minutes later, another alert appeared. This time it wasn't a squirrel. Mark pushed open my backyard gate without knocking. He wasn't carrying anything. He simply walked across the lawn with the confidence of someone entering his own property. A minute later, Jennifer followed behind him carrying a large picnic basket. Their youngest son ran ahead, cutting directly through my flower beds instead of using the worn path. Neither adult corrected him. Instead, They kept walking toward the rear opening that led to the neighborhood pond. I watched the entire thing from my kitchen, not through the window, through my phone. For the first time, I wasn't relying on memory. I had timestamps, clear video, every face, every step. I didn't go outside. I didn't argue. I simply let the camera do its job. Over the next 4 hours, the motion alerts kept coming. Friends arrived, carrying coolers. Teenagers crossed with fishing poles balanced on their shoulders. A couple pushing a stroller laughed while walking straight across the middle of my lawn. One man even paused beside my grill long enough to set down his drink before continuing. By noon, the camera had recorded 16 separate trespassing incidents. 16. I replayed several clips just to make sure I wasn't exaggerating. The recordings were crystal clear. Nobody appeared confused. Nobody hesitated. Everyone followed exactly the same route, almost as though someone had shown them where to walk. That detail caught my attention. This wasn't random anymore. It looked organized. Late that afternoon, another notification appeared. Mark had returned. Instead of walking straight through, he stopped near my raised garden beds. He looked around carefully. For several seconds, he simply stood there with his hands in his pockets. Then he bent down, picked up one of my decorative solar lights, examined it, and quietly placed it inside the cooler he was carrying. He looked over his shoulder one last time before walking away. I froze. I rewound the footage. Then I watched it again. There was no misunderstanding, no innocent explanation. The camera hadn't just recorded someone crossing my backyard. It had captured the exact moment one of my belongings disappeared. And suddenly, everything that had gone missing over the past several weeks made a lot more sense. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. Not the HOA. Not the police. Not even Linda. One video proved Mark had taken my solar light, but I wasn't interested in rushing into another argument. I wanted something stronger. If there was one thing I'd learned over the past 2 months, it was that people could explain away a single mistake. A pattern was much harder to deny. So I kept recording. The following weekend, I stayed inside almost the entire time. Whenever my phone vibrated with another motion alert, I'd quietly save the clip into a separate folder labeled Backyard Timeline. By Sunday evening, I'd already collected more than 30 recordings. Every one of them told the same story. Mark entered first. Jennifer usually followed a minute or two later. Friends came after that. Children ran through the grass. Someone always left the gate hanging open. The routine was so consistent it almost looked scheduled. I started organizing everything like I would a project at work. Each clip was renamed with the date and exact time. I created notes describing who appeared, what they carried, how long they stayed on my property, and whether any damage was visible afterward. The timeline became impossible to ignore. Saturday, 8:14 a.m. Mark crossed carrying fishing gear. 8:16. Jennifer followed with folding chairs. 8:19. 3 guests entered. Sunday, 9:03. 2 bicycles across the lawn. 9:11. Gate left open. 9:27. Children running through the flower beds. Week after week, the same behavior repeated. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't occasional. It was routine. Then something happened that surprised even me. Late one Saturday afternoon, Mark stopped halfway across my backyard while talking to one of his friends. The camera recorded everything clearly. He pointed toward my house and laughed. "It's faster this way," he said. His friend glanced toward my patio. "What if he complains again?" Mark shrugged without slowing down. "By the time anybody shows up, we're already gone." The 2 men laughed before continuing toward the pond. I replayed the conversation 3 times. The audio wasn't perfect, but every important word was understandable. That single exchange changed everything. For weeks, I'd wondered whether they honestly believed they weren't doing anything wrong. Now I had my answer. They knew exactly what they were doing. They simply believed there would never be consequences. By the end of the 3rd weekend, my evidence folder contained dozens of videos, photographs of the worn path through my lawn, and detailed notes documenting every incident. Looking at the growing collection, I finally understood something. The camera hadn't just captured trespassing. It had documented a habit, a deliberate one, and habits have a way of exposing themselves. I had no idea that the very next weekend, Mark was about to make the biggest mistake of all. one that would leave absolutely no room for excuses. By the fourth weekend, checking the camera had become part of my routine. Every motion alert went into the same folder. Every clip was labeled. Every incident was backed up. I wasn't looking for revenge anymore. I was simply documenting the truth. Saturday started exactly like the previous 3 weekends. At 8:07 a.m., Mark crossed my backyard carrying a folding table. Jennifer followed with 2 grocery bags. A few guests arrived over the next hour, cutting across the same worn path that now stretched through the middle of my lawn like an unofficial sidewalk. Nothing about it surprised me. Then, just after 11 o'clock, another notification appeared. I opened the live feed. Mark was standing beside my raised garden beds. He wasn't walking this time. He was staring at the wooden border that framed the beds I'd spent an entire spring building. He looked toward my house, then toward the pond behind the neighborhood. Finally, he bent down. At first, I thought he had dropped something. Instead, he grabbed one of the wooden corner posts that anchored the garden border. He pulled once. Nothing happened. He looked around again before bracing both hands against it. With a sharp tug, the post came loose. The pressure shifted the entire edge of the raised bed. Several boards separated just enough for soil to spill onto the grass. One side of the flower bed partially collapsed. Mark stepped backward, looked at the damage for barely 2 seconds, then shrugged. Instead of fixing it, he walked away. I stared at my phone in complete disbelief. The entire incident had lasted less than 30 seconds. No accident. No child playing nearby. No storm. Just a deliberate decision to force something loose and leave it behind. I rewound the recording. Then I watched it again. The camera angle couldn't have been clearer. His face was visible. His hands were visible. Every movement was captured from beginning to end. For weeks, I'd wondered whether anyone would believe what I'd been experiencing. Now I wasn't wondering anymore. I finally had undeniable proof that the damage to my backyard wasn't simply the result of heavy foot traffic. Someone had intentionally damaged my property. That afternoon, I walked outside after everyone had left. The corner of the raised bed leaned outward exactly as it had in the video. Fresh soil covered the surrounding grass. The loose wooden post rested where Mark had dropped it. I picked it up carefully and took several photographs before placing it back exactly where it had been. Then I returned inside without saying a single word to anyone. There was no point confronting Mark anymore. Every conversation we'd ever had ended with another excuse. This time, I didn't need his explanation. I already had something far more powerful. I had the truth, preserved frame by frame. The only question left was how much longer Mark would pretend nobody was watching. I didn't confront Mark after watching the video. That was exactly what he expected. For weeks, every disagreement had followed the same pattern. I'd say something. He'd deny it. Nothing changed. This time, I let the evidence speak for itself. Sunday morning arrived with another round of motion alerts. The first few clips looked familiar. Families crossed the yard. Children ran toward the pond. Someone left my gate hanging open again. Then, just before 10 o'clock, something different happened. Mark entered my backyard carrying a fishing rod. Halfway across the lawn, he suddenly stopped. He looked directly toward my garage. For several seconds, he stood perfectly still. Then he slowly walked closer. My stomach tightened as I watched the live feed. He had finally noticed the camera. He leaned forward, squinting at the small black device mounted beneath the roofline. His confident expression disappeared almost instantly. Instead, he glanced around the yard as though trying to figure out how long it had been there. Jennifer walked through the gate a few moments later. Mark quietly pointed toward the camera. She looked up. Even from a recording, I could see the color drain from her face. They stepped away from the garden beds and began whispering to each other. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them continued toward the pond. Instead, they turned around and walked back toward their own property. That afternoon, my doorbell rang. I already knew who it would be. Mark stood on my front porch with Jennifer beside him. For the first time since we'd met, neither of them looked relaxed. "Hey, Ethan," Mark began with an awkward smile. "I noticed you've got a new security camera." "I do." He nodded slowly. "Just wondering, how long has it been recording?" I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Long enough." Silence settled between us. Jennifer forced a laugh. We were actually going to apologize if we accidentally crossed your yard. Accidentally? She hesitated. I mean, sometimes people don't realize exactly where property lines are. I almost couldn't believe what I was hearing. After weeks of insisting my backyard was just grass, they were suddenly talking about boundaries. I think everyone knows where the property line is, I replied calmly. Mark cleared his throat. Well, no hard feelings, right? I've never wanted hard feelings. I've only wanted you to stay off my property. Neither of them responded. After a few uncomfortable seconds, Mark nodded once. Fair enough. They walked away without another word. From my living room window, I watched them disappear into their driveway. For the rest of that day, nobody crossed my backyard. Not once. But I wasn't fooled. People don't spend weeks ignoring boundaries and suddenly change because of a polite conversation. They change because they realize there's proof. And by then, I had already gathered far more proof than they could possibly imagine. The morning after Mark and Jennifer visited my front door, I finally stopped waiting for things to fix themselves. I'd given them every opportunity to respect my property. I'd asked politely. I'd spoken to the HOA. I'd stayed calm even when they laughed at me. Now I had something I'd never had before. Facts. I spent the next several hours organizing everything into a single folder. The videos were arranged by date. Each file included the exact time, along with short notes describing what happened. I added photographs of the damaged raised garden bed, the worn trail across my lawn, the missing solar light, and the footprints that appeared almost every weekend. By lunchtime, the timeline covered nearly an entire month. Looking through it, even I was surprised by how consistent everything had become. That afternoon, I emailed Susan from the HOA. Instead of writing a long explanation, I simply attached the evidence and asked if we could meet. She replied within 20 minutes. The meeting was scheduled for the following morning. When I arrived at the HOA office, Susan greeted me with a noticeably different expression than the last time we'd spoken. She wasn't skeptical anymore. She looked concerned. We sat down in a small conference room. I opened my laptop and played the first recording, then the second, then the third. Nobody interrupted. The room stayed quiet except for the sounds captured by the camera. Footsteps, conversations, the gate opening, people crossing my backyard again and again. Finally, I played the recording of Mark pulling apart the corner of my raised garden bed before walking away. Susan slowly leaned back in her chair. I didn't realize it had reached this point, she said quietly. I tried explaining it. I know. She looked at the screen again. But this is different. There was no argument left. No conflicting stories. The video showed exactly what had happened. Susan asked for copies of everything. I handed her a flash drive containing the entire folder. Before leaving, she explained that the HOA would begin its formal review immediately and notify the Collins family that documented evidence had been submitted. Later that afternoon, I also contacted the non-emergency police line to report the repeated trespassing and the property damage. The officer I spoke with remained professional from beginning to end. He explained that the videos would help establish a clear timeline and advised me to preserve the original recordings without editing them. That was exactly what I'd planned to do. For the first time since this ordeal had started, I wasn't relying on memory or hoping someone would believe my version of events. The evidence spoke for itself. And once facts are placed in front of the right people, excuses usually don't survive very long. I had a feeling Mark and Jennifer were about to learn that lesson the hard way. 3 days after my meeting with the HOA, I received another email from Susan. The board had scheduled a formal hearing for Thursday evening. Both Mark and Jennifer had been asked to attend. So had I. When I arrived, the small meeting room was already filling up. Several board members sat around a long table with laptops and printed documents. Mark and Jennifer were seated across the room. For the first time since this ordeal began, neither of them looked confident. Mark folded his arms and avoided eye contact. Jennifer kept whispering to him while nervously tapping her foot against the floor. Susan welcomed everyone before explaining why we were there. We're here to review documented complaints involving repeated trespassing and property damage. She nodded toward me. Ethan has provided video evidence covering multiple weekends. Mark immediately cleared his throat. I think this has all been blown out of proportion. One board member looked up. Let's watch the recordings first. The lights dimmed slightly as Susan connected my flash drive to the conference room screen. The first video began. Mark entered my backyard. Jennifer followed. Then came friends carrying coolers. Children crossed the flower beds. Nobody hesitated. Nobody knocked. The second recording played. Then the third. Then another. The timestamps changed. The behavior didn't. After nearly 15 minutes of footage, the room had become completely silent. One board member quietly asked, "Does this happen every weekend?" Susan glanced at my notes. Based on the recordings, yes. Mark shifted in his chair. We thought the previous owner didn't mind. A board member paused the video. The current homeowner clearly asked you to stop. Mark didn't answer. The next clip appeared on the screen. Everyone watched as he stopped beside my raised garden bed, looked around, pulled the corner post loose, and walked away without attempting to fix it. Nobody said a word. Jennifer finally broke the silence. That wasn't intentional. One of the board members replayed the clip, slowly, frame by frame. The recording showed Mark looking toward my house before using both hands to pull the post free. The room fell quiet again. There wasn't much left to debate. After another moment, Susan closed the laptop. I believe we've seen enough. Mark opened his mouth, as though searching for another explanation. Nothing came out. The confidence he'd shown for weeks had disappeared completely. As the meeting ended, several neighbors quietly approached me in the hallway. Mr. Henderson shook my hand. "I'm sorry we stayed silent." Another resident nodded. "We honestly didn't realize it was happening this often." I thanked them. I wasn't interested in hearing apologies. I was relieved people finally understood the truth. Walking back to my truck, I realized something important. The videos hadn't changed what happened. They had simply made it impossible for anyone to pretend it wasn't happening anymore. And that was exactly what I needed from the beginning. The HOA didn't make its decision that night. Instead, Susan explained that the board would review everything one final time before sending written notices to everyone involved. I wasn't expecting an answer immediately. After all, the evidence covered weeks of recordings, photographs, and written documentation. Still, by Monday afternoon, an email arrived. The subject line simply read, "HOA decision." I opened it with a steady hand. After reviewing the evidence, the board concluded that repeated trespassing had occurred and that the Collins family had ignored multiple requests to stay off private property. They were formally instructed to stop entering my backyard immediately and warned that any future violations could result in additional action under the community's governing rules. I read the message twice, not because I doubted it, because after everything that happened, it almost didn't feel real. Later that same day, Susan called me personally. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she said. The board voted unanimously. "Thank you," I replied. "You did the hard part," she answered. "You documented everything." For the first time in months, I felt like someone had actually listened. The changes around the neighborhood happened almost overnight. The worn path across my backyard disappeared. The back gate stayed closed. Saturday morning arrived, and my phone stayed silent. No motion alerts. No footsteps. No coolers. No bicycles. Just birds moving through the maple trees and a light breeze across the lawn. I stepped onto the patio with my coffee and simply stood there. The silence felt unfamiliar, peaceful, almost strange. Over the next week, I noticed something else. Neighbors who had barely spoken to me before suddenly smiled and waved while walking past my house. Mr. Henderson stopped during his evening walk. "I'm glad that finally got resolved," he said. "So am I." He looked toward my backyard. It always should have been respected. I appreciated the comment more than he probably realized. A few days later, Linda knocked on my front door, carrying a small potted herb. "I figured your garden deserved a fresh start," she said with a grin. I laughed for the first time in weeks. "Thank you." She looked toward the fence separating my yard from the Collins property. "Haven't seen anyone crossing lately." "No," I said. "Funny how quickly boundaries matter when there's evidence." She smiled knowingly. "So, what are you going to do with the camera now?" I glanced toward the garage where it still quietly watched over the backyard. "I'm leaving it exactly where it is. Not because I expected more problems, but because I'd learned something important. Sometimes the presence of accountability is enough to change people's behavior. As I looked across my lawn that evening, the grass was finally beginning to grow back over the worn path. Little by little, nature was erasing the damage. I hoped the neighborhood would do the same. Almost 3 weeks passed without a single incident. No footprints, no motion alerts, no bicycles cutting across my lawn. For the first time since the Collins family moved in, my backyard actually felt like it belonged to me again. I began relaxing on the patio after work instead of constantly checking the camera app. Then, one Saturday afternoon, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole. Mark was standing on my front porch alone. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't carrying a cooler or a fishing rod. He simply stood there with his hands in his pockets. I opened the door. "Hey, Ethan," he said quietly. "Can we talk for a minute?" I stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind me. "What's on your mind?" He looked toward the street before answering. "I've been thinking about everything that happened." I waited. I guess things got out of hand. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest he'd come. "For months," I said calmly, "I asked you to stop." "I know. I wasn't trying to start a fight." "I know." You laughed. He lowered his eyes. I did. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Mark let out a slow breath. "I honestly didn't think it was that big of a deal." "I know you didn't, but it was my property." He nodded. "I see that now." I appreciated the honesty, even if it had arrived much later than it should have. "I'm not looking for enemies," I told him. "I bought this house because I wanted peace. I wasn't trying to ruin your weekends. I just wanted my backyard to stay mine." Mark looked toward the fence separating our properties. "I've told everyone not to use your yard anymore." I noticed. "They won't." "I believe you." He gave a small nod. "I'm sorry about the garden bed." Those 6 words surprised me more than anything else he'd said. "Thank you," I replied. He extended his hand. For a moment, I hesitated. Not because I was angry, because trust doesn't return the moment someone says they're sorry. It returns through consistent actions over time. Still, I shook his hand. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us pretended the past hadn't happened. We simply acknowledged that the situation was finally over. As Mark walked back toward his house, I noticed something different. Instead of cutting across the corner of my lawn like he always had, he stayed on the sidewalk all the way to his driveway. It was a small decision, one most people would never notice. But I did, because that simple walk around the block meant more than any argument we'd ever had. For the first time since this all began, the boundary between our homes wasn't just marked by a fence. It was respected, and somehow that made the entire neighborhood feel quieter than ever before. Life has a funny way of reminding you how valuable peace is. For months, I'd spent every weekend expecting another problem. Every sound outside made me look toward the backyard. Every motion alert made my stomach tighten. Even when I wasn't home, I found myself opening the camera app just to make sure everything was still where I'd left it. I hadn't realized how exhausting that constant stress had become until it disappeared. The following Saturday, I woke up just after sunrise. Out of habit, I reached for my phone and opened the security app. No alerts. I smiled. Instead of checking again every few minutes, I set the phone down, poured myself a cup of coffee, and walked out onto the patio. The morning was quiet. The maple trees swayed gently in the breeze. Birds hopped across the fence. The only footprints in the grass belonged to a curious squirrel that had wandered through during the night. For the first time in months, I wasn't waiting for someone to appear through the back gate. I was simply enjoying my own backyard. Over the next several weeks, the change became impossible to ignore. The grass slowly filled in where the worn shortcut had once stretched across the middle of my lawn. The tomato plants recovered and produced more fruit than they had all season. I rebuilt the corner of the raised garden bed using stronger brackets and fresh cedar boards. When I finished, it looked even better than before. One evening, Linda walked over while I was watering the garden. "It finally feels peaceful again," she said. "It does." She smiled. "You know, you've inspired a few people around here." I laughed. "I don't think installing one camera is exactly inspirational." "I'm not talking about the camera," she replied. "I'm talking about how you handled everything." I looked at her curiously. "You stayed calm. You documented facts. You never screamed across the fence. You never tried to embarrass anyone. You just let the truth speak." I hadn't thought about it that way before. At the time, I'd simply been trying to protect my property. But maybe she was right. Arguments create more arguments. Facts create solutions. A month later, the HOA held its annual neighborhood picnic at the community park. I almost skipped it. After everything that had happened, I wasn't sure I wanted to spend an afternoon around people who had watched the situation unfold from a distance. In the end, I decided to go. To my surprise, several neighbors stopped to thank me. Not because anyone enjoyed the conflict, because they appreciated that someone had finally addressed a problem many had quietly noticed. Mr. Henderson smiled as he handed me a paper plate. "I've lived here nearly 20 years," he said. "I've learned that good neighbors respect boundaries." I couldn't agree more. As the afternoon went on, I noticed Mark and Jennifer on the opposite side of the park. They kept to themselves. We exchanged a brief nod from across the picnic area. Nothing more. Honestly, that was enough. Not every disagreement needs to end with friendship. Sometimes mutual respect is the better outcome. By autumn, my backyard looked better than it had the day I bought the house. The grass was healthy. The flowers had returned. The shortcut that dozens of people once treated like a public walkway had completely disappeared beneath fresh green growth. If someone had moved in a neighborhood that fall, they never would have guessed what had happened there just a few months earlier. The camera remained mounted beneath my garage roof. Friends occasionally asked why I still kept it there. My answer was always the same. It reminds me that protecting your home doesn't mean losing your temper. It means paying attention. It means documenting the truth. It means staying patient when others expect you to react emotionally. Looking back now, I realize the camera didn't solve the problem by itself. The camera simply revealed reality. The real difference came from choosing evidence over arguments, patience over anger, and facts over assumptions. Those choices changed everything. These days, my weekends look the way I always imagined they would. I grill burgers with friends. I read on the patio beneath the maple trees. I harvest tomatoes from the same garden beds I once worried might never recover. Sometimes I catch myself looking toward the back gate. Old habits are hard to break. Then I smile when I realize it hasn't opened unexpectedly in a very long time. Owning a home isn't just about the walls or the roof. Sometimes it's about knowing the space you've worked so hard to build is finally respected. And every peaceful Saturday morning reminds me that one small camera didn't just record problem. It gave me my backyard back.